Hello and welcome to the Keyshot 8 introduction. So what are we looking at here? On the left we have the library panel. Think of it like a menu where you order up your materials and your environments as the main two things that I use. In the middle you have your real-time viewing window where you'll see your file. And on the right you have your project panel where it'll show you sort of the solid bodies, a list of them, edit the existing materials, the existing environment, so on and so forth. Of course you have icons on the top and bottom. On the bottom here, import and render being some of the two more important ones. So yeah, let's get right into it. You want to import your file. So unfortunately, Keyshot 8 I do not think recognizes SOLIDWORKS 2020 files. So once you have your assembly in SOLIDWORKS, you want to go to File, Save As, and you want to save it as a step file. Either of these settings works. I believe this just records a little bit more data and information, so it'd be a larger file size. But I believe these both work the same way. So yep, save as file type, select this and click on save, and it'll output this. So once you're in here, you can click on import. And again, I'm going to go to my step file and say open. If you try and import the SOLIDWORKS file, it might give you an error. Here for Keyshot import settings, I believe these are all default. I think for SOLIDWORKS, you want to make sure your up orientation is Y. I believe it's different for Rhino. And then for tessellation quality, 0.4. But you can match this if it's not the default. So then click on import. And so now we see our objects in the middle of our viewing window. So as far as like Keyshot workflow, it's pretty much in the order in which they have it in the project panel, at least my workflow. So starting with our scene, material, environment, lighting, camera, approaching it in that order. But of course, everyone has their own workflow, so you may have a different order. So the scene is simply just the objects. Here we have it in our project panel. You can see it's labeled. I often don't mess with this. If it's a large file, I might start to rename things. Sometimes it does, like if I have an open view and closed view from SOLIDWORKS, this is where I might drag, you can drag and relocate or rename them open, closed. So often that's like the only time I'll mess with this is if I exported a file with like multiple orientations of objects, but otherwise I leave this as is. So next up is material. So what we want to do is go to our material library here, and you can just simply drag and drop materials onto bodies. You'll notice that it applied the same material to the two separate bodies. That's because this handle was one part file. Even those two separate bodies, it just makes an assumption that you want them to be the same. But it should import as two separate bodies still. So you can see that here. If for some reason you don't see the two separate bodies, you might want to go back in SOLIDWORKS and check that they're not merged. Now in order to separate the materials, you want to right click on one of the bodies and go to unlink material. And now for example, you could go to pick up like a brushed aluminum or maybe like a rough aluminum and drag it over and have the two different materials on there. So that's one way to apply materials, drag and drop from the material library. The other way to apply materials is copying and like sort of pasting materials from the file already. So if you hold down Shift and left click and then right click, so for example, I can Shift and left click the shiny handle front and I can right click the material and apply it to the cap on the knob and maybe like the bezel on the knob. Same I can do for the sort of touch point and copy that over. Just be aware that what that means is that they are now attached. So if I go back to the plastic and the rough, if I drag like a green over, you can see now that they both have this neon green applied. And again, to break that relationship, you would just want to right click and say unlink if you wanted to have them be two different materials. As far as preferred materials, I think the plastic, hard plastic gets you a long way. The difference between rough and shiny is there's a slider in the material tab that adjusts the amount of like gloss reflection, and that's just the main difference between these two. So I think that's my preferred like all-round plastic. If you want something like more realistic, you can play with mold tech. Most plastics in real life have a texture to them, and this would be your best bet here. Other materials I like are the Axalta paint, especially for something like metallic, like the body here. It has a nice kind of gloss, reflective factor to it. It's just harder to change the colors of this. You'll see there's different options depending on the materials you choose. So the only negative to these is they are kind of the color that they are, but it's good options here. So the plastic, if I double click on this, you'll notice it loads the custom material settings here. The diffuse is simply the color. So if I can double click on this, I can pick sort of a green and maybe try and match. Maybe I want it to be more of a blue-green to match this body, maybe a bit darker, where you can kind of just set the hue. Specular is sort of the color of reflected light. I would leave that at white. As mentioned before, the roughness is how glossy you want it to be. The more glossy, the harder the plastic will look. So I think something in the middle here is nice for like a soft touch. For what it's worth, there is a soft plastic here. I don't prefer it. I feel like it slows down the render and it has kind of a weird quality to it. That's just purely my opinion. So yeah, you have your custom settings in here. Textures we get more into in Project 3, but the diffuse is kind of like a gift wrap, putting wrapping paper on stuff. Bump is like a 3D. Opacity is as described. Labels is like stickers, so if you want to put branding or like knob settings on here. But we really don't need to mess with that for this project. Up next would be the environments. So the startup environment's pretty good. If anything, it's just like a bit basic, a bit vanilla. It's not that punchy. I'll use it if I'm just doing a quick render or like it doesn't need to be anything spectacular. But my preferred default is actually the panels option. So here again in the library environment, go to panels. More often than not, I use one of these two. It's just a bit more punchy. So you can like double click on it to load the environment or drag it. And so I typically do not like the background to be the environment color. So once you're in your project panel in the environment tab, if you go to settings, my preferred is to just click on color and leave it white. I know some people like to maybe try and match the sort of object color, or maybe like a pastel of the object color. And that can be cool too. So yeah, to your own preference. But for me, just keeping it simple and white is what I typically do. Once you're in your environment here, you can hold down Control and drag to rotate the environment, or drag on this slider. I think it's just a little bit quicker to hold down Control and left mouse button. But I don't mess with that too much until I set up my camera view. So I mean, once after environment, you go to lighting. Again, I tend to leave this as default. The main thing you want to check is that self shadows are on. But yeah, basic and product mode. Sometimes switching between product mode and interior mode can fix some issues, specifically with clear materials. If you have like a lot of these like little orbs of light, often that's caused by product mode for what it's worth. But I tend to not mess with this. The camera is basically, you just kind of want to set up your ideal view here. So for me, it's kind of like a 3/4, something like this. Again, just clicking and dragging. And to save your camera view, you can click on this camera plus icon and you can name it if you want, you don't have to. And it's just a way that like if you tumble around and like go back to here, it'll snap back to that saved view. So definitely handy organization, especially if you're rendering multiple things that you want to look from the same view. As far as settings go, distance, all of this stuff tends to be set by clicking and dragging. Obviously you want perspective on. As far as focal length, I believe this 50 is the default. I think dragging it down a bit to like 35 makes your object look a bit more punchy and dynamic. I wouldn't go lower than 35 though. It's going to look too extreme, and I probably wouldn't go bigger than 60. So that's just my advice. For this, I'm going to leave it 35. And once you're happy with kind of the way your object is looking and positioned, what I might do is hit this save icon and maybe even lock the camera. And this way, like now I'm clicking and dragging, it's not going to move. If I need to move it around, I can use the free camera again and go back here. But once your camera is set, this is where I go back to environment and maybe like control click to, kind of get, maybe I want the highlight across the top or something to position that. Now, these 2 and 3 panels in startup will get you pretty far, I think, to a rendering that's easy to read and clear, hopefully. But if you have the time, I think my preferred is to actually set up my own custom environment, and I think it's worth showing you how to do that. So again, we're back in the environment tab. in the library panel under Studio Basic. You can actually load multiple environments and toggle between them. So I'm actually going to select this all black 4K. Depending on what I'm doing, sometimes I'll select one of these gradients, but for full custom, more often than not, I'll just take this and I'll drag it over here into our environment panel. And here you can see we can toggle back and forth. So you want to add your custom lights. So in order to do that, you want to go to HDRI editor. And if you don't see these icons at the top, it's just dragging this bar. And you want to find pin light and click on this. And what it does is it creates a light within the HDRI editor here. And you can kind of drag it around to where you want it. Typically, it should preload a click to place option, but if it doesn't, you can click on this icon. This is what the preloaded click to place looks like. It'll just be this note at the bottom. And here you can see wherever you click on your object is where it'll place the light. So if I click on the top, it puts it on the top. If I click on the side, it does the same. For the first light, I like to try and catch this edge here, as it's just kind of like a nice product highlight to grab. And you can also play with the settings here. So I might like drag the brightness up to kind of make that edge pop a bit more. Now, as far as the other lights, I like to go for a basic sort of 1, 2, 3 lighting, which is a recap on the basics. Now, what that is the top surface is often the lightest part, so that would be the 1 light. And then for the sides, 1 would be the medium, so the 2, and 1 would be the darkest, would be the 3. And you should be able to set this up with, about 3 to 4 lights maximum. So the next light I like to do is the top one, so I click on this pin here. Now it auto-loaded the click to place. So I'm just going to click on the top here. This top light I tend to make bigger, so I can drag the radius here like this. I also tend to play with the fall off. If you watch up here, it's going to get fuzzy as I drag this. It's just kind of a more gentle, soft light. And I can keep clicking to place. You can also like drag this around and see if you get different effects. It's a little less precise, but sometimes it's just another way to play with it. So if you want maybe a bit more of a gradient along the top here. It's an inexact science, but here it looks like a little lighter to me here, a little more saturated here, so I'm happy with where this is, and I'm just going to click done. The third and final light that I'm going to put on here is probably clicking on the knob front. And again, it auto-loaded this click to place if it doesn't click on here. Now, one thing you can do is change the shape of the light. So in this case, I'm going to make it a rectangle. What that allows you to do is change, you can change it independent, the length independent of width and height. So maybe I want like more of a wide light on this front here to kind of catch this whole handle. And make sure it's catching the knob and just sort of playing with the brightness. But you don't want it to like blow out to pure white here. And yeah, so again, it'd be like the 1 is the top, 2 is this front, and 3 this darkest side here. And you can always go back to these lights and adjust them. Again, to reload the placement, you can click on this, or you can just sort of drag it around here, or maybe play with the radius size. I'm trying to get a bit more light on the side. This is something where there's like, the amount of fussing can be to your own preference. And it's easy to lose a lot of time just like fussing around in here. But I think as long as you get something close, to this nice, 1, 2, 3, something pretty straightforward. I'm going to turn the brightness on my top here to get the 1 to punch a bit more. Yeah, once you get something to your liking, you're good to go. So yeah, that's basically the workflow. After you have your lighting set in your environment, you can go back and like mess with materials and stuff, and kind of rinse and repeat as needed. One thing that I like to do if I'm messing with materials is going back to the scene portion in the project tree is to click on these 2 little arrows here. This opens up the model set tab, and if I click on this add model set, you can add different colorways without kind of saving over what you've already done. So what I did is here I added a new model set. I can go back to my material library and down to the plastic option. And and drag over a color. Again, if you want to separate the materials, you can right click and say unlink. And now you have sort of like a different, maybe branded colorway. But if you want to go back to what you had previously, you simply like uncheck that box and check this one, and you still have it saved. If you want to update the thumbnail, it's simply just going down. It's in this model set tab down here and just render preview. So this can be a quick way to like reference for yourself what it looks like to update it. As a kind of deeper setting along this lines, there is a studio panel. And what this does is not only does it save, you can like load the model set down here, but you can also load the environment. So maybe I want like the environment default on this one. And then I can click on this to add a new studio, and maybe, I want my custom lighting, for this branded option or this other colorway. So yeah, these are just workflow things. I tend to use the model sets, but nothing more. So once you have everything set up, the final thing to do is to render. So you want to go ahead and click on this render tab. The default settings, it's always to the keyshot folder, which is frustrating. I'll navigate to my project folder, or sometimes even just like the desktop, so I know where to find it quickly and then file it away later. As far as file formats go, I typically do JPEGs or PNGs. The nice thing with a PNG is you can check this box to include an alpha transparency, and so anything white will be transparent. So that's like kind of a good default to go with here. As far as rendering passes go, if you check the clown pass, this will automatically output a file where each different material, or maybe it's even each different body, is like kind of a pure saturated color, which makes color selection in Photoshop easy for editing. So if you're the kind of person that likes to edit your work in Photoshop when it's done, a clown pass is helpful to do. As far as options, I tend to go with the default. The more samples you push here, the higher quality the render will be. For what it's worth, you can also render on maximum time. So it's like how much, and it will put out the best render it can. So those are just some render settings. For resolution, here you can see the print size. For this project, I would maybe try and do something along these lines. It depends on your computer. As a rule of thumb, you can think about the size of your PDF and make sure, if it's just for the screen, you can do the size of your PDF at 72 dpi if your computer's kind of slow. But I tend to render things at either 300 or 200 dpi for print quality. And yeah, once you're ready, you just click render. There is a queue setting, so if you want to set up a bunch of renders, you can say add job. You can see here, these are like old renders that have been saved and remembered. Adding the job and clicking process queue will run all of those. All right, there you go, that's Keyshot.